Okay, everyone, welcome back. I'm going to continue with chapter 2. I completed the section on growth spurts. Pay attention to the onset, the apex, the height, and the weight that occurs, and make sure you pay attention to the difference between males and females. Uh, I'm picking it back up now on page 54, Secular Trends in Puberty. A secular trend is a pattern of change over time. In this chapter, though, it's changed up a little bit, and specifically it says patterns of pubertal onset over time. And so it's very specific to patterns of change related to puberty. And in figure 7 there on page 54, you'll see a graph that the lines are moving from top to bottom, left to right. And it can be a bit confusing because there's lots of different lines. Basically, those are just different countries around the world. But what I want you to notice is that the onset of menarche and the onset of puberty for young girls, it shows back in 1840, was up above 17 years of age. And by 1960 into 1980, it's below 13 years of age. So there's been a secular trend moving downward as far as the onset, meaning younger and younger ages. Continuing, we're going to move on to the psychological dimensions of puberty. And so now they're talking about how kids feel about going through puberty, not just the actual physical things that change, but how do they feel about it. Some things boys and girls have in common, and then some things are different. So let's look first at the PowerPoint talking about what they have in common. First off, both males and females are preoccupied, obviously, with the changes they're going through, and even more specifically, they're constantly looking in the mirror. They're looking at their face, for instance, to see if they look more grown up, more adult-like. And as they're doing that, they're looking even closer, and they're really concerned about things like their complexion. And those are big issues for these kids as they go through this time. When you get into the psychological dimensions based on gender, it kind of changes up a little bit. So for females, always pick an answer that says it's a mixed blessing, or they have mixed feelings. On the one hand, they're glad to experience puberty and moving on towards a more adult-like body, but it comes with some concerns, and we'll get into some of those specifics, but it's sufficient to say at this time from a biological perspective, typically they put on more body fat. A higher percentage of their body is fat. We talked about that last time. And this causes some concerns for them, and their faces are a little rounder because of putting on fat. So they have mixed feelings about it, and later on we'll talk about some of the social concerns that they have. For males, pick an answer that rarely do I tell you always, but here's one where the answer is always. Guys are going to feel good about going through puberty. Now, obviously, if they're not, and they're late maturing, they have problems with it. But once puberty starts for males, they feel good about it. And that's because rather than putting on body fat, they're putting on muscle mass. And that's specifically because of testosterone. So rather than have a baby face, a rounder face, they're going to have a more adult-like face, more angular. They're going to have broader shoulders and bigger muscles. And so to them, it's all good. In the middle of page 56, there's some research about hormones and behavior. So they're talking about correlations between different factors. So what is the correlation between an increase of hormones during puberty and kids' behavior? So if you start reading, unfortunately, it would lead you to believe that there's sufficient research to indicate that, higher levels of testosterone, for instance, might lead to aggression in males. Higher levels of estrogen may lead to depression or mood swings in females. But this is one of those sections you have to keep reading, and I'm looking here in the book at the third paragraph under that section, and it begins with the word however. And so that kind of undoes everything above, because what that however paragraph is talking about is however social factors show 2 to 4 times more effect on behavior than do biological factors. So what are they talking about? They're saying after studying all the hormones, you can't discount social factors, and specifically they're talking about peer influence on behavior, family, trauma, abandonment issues, divorce in families, and things like that have a much more powerful influence on kids' behavior than simply hormones. Early and late maturation starts at the bottom of that page, continues to the next page. These are a couple of studies I'm going to touch on. One is called the Berkeley Longitudinal Study. And if you remember from chapter 1, a longitudinal study follows the same people as much as possible over time. And so in the Berkeley study, I'm just going to discuss males, and then there's a study on females that's under the Milwaukee study. But under the Berkeley study, let's look at that. Basically, what they found was that early maturing males perceive themselves to be more socially competent. They're basically saying that they have a lot of friends, that they get along with a lot of people, and that's their perception of themselves, and that they're just more popular in general and happy with being an early maturing male. So they're maturing before their peers, their counterparts. Late maturing males, on the other hand, obviously reported negative feelings about that, and it created a lot of problems for them. Now the longitudinal part is when they revisit these men in their 30s. So we're going to fast forward now nearly 20 years, and they re-interview them. And what they found, and be careful here, because don't pick an answer that says that late maturing men were more successful than early maturing males. That's not what the study is saying. What it says is that late maturing men had a better sense of identity by their 30s than did early maturing males. And you have to go back to Erik Erikson's theory on identity versus role confusion or identity confusion. And what they believe is going on here, these late maturing males, since they're not probably involved in sports like the early maturing males, they turn their attention to academics and future thinking like what a late adolescent would do. And they were more prepared and probably further along in their careers than were early maturing males. The problem with that is then that this study takes another twist, and be careful again on the test, and that is when they give that information to late maturing males that they are further along in their identity, maybe in their home, in their careers. In other words, they're saying, do you see how you're somewhat better off than some of those early maturing males that you were kind of envious of? If you could go back in time, would you prefer to be an early maturing male, or would you say, no, now I'm glad I was a late maturing male? And the response was that in spite of knowing this, the late maturing males still said no. They would have preferred to have been an early maturing male because they found that to be too traumatic, a difficult time for them. When you look at the female side of the study, and that's the Milwaukee study, part of the problems, I told you before, the mixed feelings, the mixed blessings, if you will, was the percentage of body fat for the girls, but there's some social issues involved also. And so since these girls typically begin puberty 2 years before the male counterparts, these girls are beginning even younger than that, so they really feel out of place. And so the problem with that is they begin associating with older groups of kids outside of their age group. Usually outside means more than 2 years. So 4, 5, 6 years older than them. And the problem with that is they get involved in things that the older adolescents are getting involved in, and they get in over their heads, and it starts causing problems for them. It starts causing conflict with their families because they want to begin dating. The parents, of course, feel they're way too young, and the people they want to date and hang out with are way too old. And so there's a lot of social issues. It doesn't mean all girls who mature early have the problems, but they certainly are there in the research. And it could be things like conflicts with parents, wanting to date early, poor grades in school, depression, and things like that. There's also part of this study that looks at the longitudinal aspects of it. So they surveyed these girls in the sixth grade, early and late maturing girls. Generally speaking, early maturing girls reported that they were happy that they were beginning to move towards a more adult-like body. So basically said they were satisfied with what was happening. And late maturing girls, of course, said they were not satisfied with their bodies. When they re-interviewed these girls in high school, in the 10th grade, that was a sixth grade group of girls, when they re-interviewed in the 10th grade, the answers totally reversed. And late maturing girls said they were satisfied with their body and the changes, and early maturing girls said they were dissatisfied. So the question really is then what's going on here? What researchers believe is going on is that since menarche and puberty can be triggered by an increase of weight, we talked about that under body mass, that what they've also found is that early maturing girls tend to be shorter and heavier by the time they finish their growth spurt, and late maturing girls generally tend to be taller and thinner, and that's a more popular thing among young people today. On the bottom of 57, I don't really have a PowerPoint for it. It's pretty straightforward. It says, are puberty's effects exaggerated? In other words, do young people exaggerate the trauma of going through puberty? And the answer is, of course, yes. Young people tend to overstate or exaggerate things, and so for them, it's a traumatic time. It's a difficult adjustment period, but it's really overstated. It's no more difficult than any other stage that people are going to go through as they move through developmental periods. We're going to switch gears here on page 60, middle of the page, risk-taking behavior. I think without saying much, I think common sense would tell you that young people take more risk than do older people. And as we get older, we minimize our risk-taking behavior. But the question then is, what's at the root of risk-taking behavior? What causes young people to be high-risk takers? The population I work with, we deal with 100% of kids who are called at-risk or high-risk kids. And so we do a lot of work with these kids and try to understand what's going on. Well, basically, the author addresses two issues. One's biological, the other is social. The biological issue has to do more with the brain and a section of the brain in the left temporal lobe called the amygdala. So familiarize yourself with that. Read up a little bit. The amygdala is the seat of emotions. It's part of the limbic system. It triggers all the emotions and the feelings that kids have, and it's fully developed in early adolescence. And because of that, they use it a lot, they react to it, and they respond to it. So when they feel something, they overreact actually to their feelings, and that leads to impulsivity. When you do research on ADHD, and one of those features could be impulsive behavior, when you're impulsive, you tend not to think through something, you simply react, and when you're impulsive, you don't make very good decisions. And in fact, that leads to risk-taking behavior. The other thing that's going on is social, and that's peer influence. And we'll be discussing peer influence a lot more in chapter 13. But we deal with that a lot also in our program out here. And that is that kids are strongly influenced by their peers. And it could be simply having fun and daring them to do something, or a sense of wanting to belong, so they don't want to, even though they may not want to engage in some silly act that could get them injured, they're afraid to say no because they may be rejected or made fun of by their peers. In either case, they engage in behaviors. And I guess the last thing we could say that the author doesn't address too much is that in some ways they are very egocentric, and they really think that they know they're not indestructible, but they really don't think they're going to get hurt. It's always going to be somebody else, not them. That might have happened to someone else, but that's not going to happen in their case. And these are all reasons for the risk-taking behavior. Now, the discussion continues, well, if we're aware of this, that kids are doing this, and quite honestly, this leads to problems as far as accidents and even death in young people. So what can we do as a society to help them? And one of the things that the author talks about is a thing called social capital. So social capital has to do with the resources we make available, the opportunities to provide an alternative to young people to engage in fun. Kids want to have fun, they want to recreate, and if there are no safe places, I'll use an example of skateboarding and kids skateboarding on streets, highways, down steps and railings, and being injured. Well, a community might develop a skateboard park where they're going to be supervised. There's going to be adult supervision. They have to follow certain rules, bring certain equipment like a helmet, knee pads, things like that. And if they begin to horseplay too much and clown around, and they would ask them to leave. Another example of social capital might be providing Little League, T-ball, little basketball leagues, and things like that. Recreation centers, Big Brother, Big Sister programs, brothers, sisters, boys and girls programs for after-school activities. And this is designed to reduce the risk that kids are taking if they're out and unsupervised, trying to find something to do to recreate. The leading causes of death, which is on page 62, is a follow-up to this risk-taking behavior. So like I said, sometimes they're engaging in behavior that could lead to serious injury or even death. And so when they talk about the leading causes of death, I'm going to discuss three of them in the order of first cause, second cause, and then the third. So the first and leading cause is accidental death, and it's because of the impulsivity and the risk-taking behavior. And when they are dying of accidental deaths, and that's 50% of the population of young people, by the way, and when this is happening specifically, the most common accidental deaths are in automobile accidents, and 75% of those 50% of kids who are dying, 75% of the time it's in an auto accident. And then to further exacerbate the problem, 50% of that is due to alcohol. And so we'll talk about in chapter 3 how kids acquire knowledge, but they don't apply knowledge. So they certainly know the dangers of driving and certainly driving under the influence, and yet they proceed anyway to take these risks, and it leads to the number one cause of death for them. Second leading cause of death among young people is homicide. And so homicide obviously is kids killing kids. So we're really looking at gun violence, street violence, and more often than not, inner city, high crime neighborhoods in which they're infested with gangs, and these kids are engaging in some pretty violent behavior towards one another. More specifically, read the material. There's a study in there that talks about young African American males in inner city high crime are 3 times more likely to end up dead because of homicide rather than other causes of death. And it is because it's such a high risk behavior of carrying firearms and acting impulsively, and partly because of their environment. The third leading cause of death among young people is suicides. The suicide rate since the 1950s among young people has tripled. Now your book will go on to say, however, there has been a slight decrease in the rate of suicide among young people in recent years. And so we'll stay with that, but since the book has been published, I think they've seen a turn, and the rate is going back up just slightly. So I'll talk more about suicide in chapter 13. That's about the time I want to spend today. Friday, I'm going to finish up this chapter. I will review the key terms at the end of the chapter with you that you should have picked up during the lecture and or reading, the important names that I want you to know about, and kind of a quick review of chapter 2. Next week we will take care of chapter 3 in preparation for the test the following week.
Next week.
Next week.
Next week is the test.
Okay. All right. Thank you.